All right, welcome to part two of the proteins lecture. We've gotten through most of the lecture. This is a little bit shorter part two than normal. So let's finally start talking about proteins that we consume, right? We've kind of talked about their context in terms of, when to consume them after training and how much, and protein synthesis and protein breakdown. Let's talk about proteins in our diet. So proteins are often referred to as being high quality and low quality when people are assessing proteins. And I'm not a big fan of those distinctions, but they're out there, so I at least want to share them with you. A better word to use to describe them would be complete versus incomplete proteins. And so something that's considered a complete protein is a protein food that includes all of the essential amino acids. So it means that of those 9 essential amino acids, they're all in there in adequate amounts so that you wouldn't have to consume more of that essential amino acid to take care of normal sort of protein needs on a given day. Complete proteins are animal sources, so meats, dairy, egg. There are some plant-based complete proteins. Soy is considered complete, so soy proteins, soy products. Quinoa as a grain is considered a complete protein as well. There's a few others out there. The incomplete proteins then are missing at least one of the essential amino acids in its protein or its an amino acid profile. So again, Chronometer does this, which is kind of cool, right? So incomplete protein, you're missing at least one amino acid of the essential amino acids. These are found plant sources, right? So you got your beans and your rice and your other vegetables and all that kind of stuff. Those are incomplete proteins. Gelatin is the one animal product that is considered an incomplete protein. We don't eat too much gelatin, I guess, but it's out there. The idea, don't worry about the all or none principle in protein synthesis, but the idea of complementary proteins is something worth discussing. So the complementary proteins, individuals who are going to eat a meal, whether you're a vegetarian or not, you want to make sure and complement all your meals or include in all your meals a complete protein, right? You don't want to, especially on a regular basis, be consuming foods that aren't providing you the full complement of essential amino acids. And so the idea of complementary proteins comes from that. And so if you're going to have a meal that, let's say there's no animal products in it, let's say you're vegetarian, right? And surely there's some of you out there. How do you ensure that you get a complete protein in your meal? Well, complementary proteins are the way to do it. And so the complementary proteins is just the practice of combining a food that might be low in one amino acid with the food essential amino acid with the food that's high in that other food's missing amino acid. So one of the best examples, one of my favorite examples, is using beans and rice, right? Beans are a legume, right? Beans and legumes are low in methionine, right? So the essential amino acid that beans are low in that make it incomplete is methionine. Well, so if you have a plate of beans, sure, it's a decent source of protein, but you're missing methionine. So what would you pair beans with? Well, a food that's high in methionine, which would be something like a grain product or maybe rice, right? So beans and rice are an amazingly good combination of proteins that complement each other to provide the full spectrum to make them to make them a complete protein. With the full essential amino acid profile. So there's other examples of this on the screen here. The complementary protein approach is really critical, especially again for vegetarians. It's in the more sort of, more extreme, I use extreme lightly, but extreme vegetarians who don't do any animal products, so no dairy and no eggs, right? They need to be particularly mindful of creating habits of complementing plant foods to provide complete essential amino acid profiles in the foods that they eat. So I love this little graphic. Back in my earlier days, and I was a vegetarian for like 28 years, not anymore. I do eat fish now. So, but I had this on my refrigerator back when I was an ambitious, whatever I was, 19-year-old. And it helps, right? You're putting meals together. You don't want to skip out on those amino acids. You don't want to deprive your body of things that it needs. And especially when we look at nutrition as a field of habit, right? We all kind of have certain eating habits on a regular basis. I tend to eat these foods. Well, you want to make sure that the foods that you tend to eat on a regular basis are providing you with a full protein, a complete protein. So let's talk a little bit more about plant proteins in general. They do kind of get beat up a little bit in a lot of contexts. If you're vegetarian, you're not getting enough protein. The protein you're getting from plants isn't good enough anyway. It's not true. Definitely not true. Plant proteins, they're definitely provide us with high quality proteins. The amino acids are amino acids. It doesn't matter if it comes from a meat product or a plant product. Structurally, chemically, they're the same thing. There is a bit of a concern if you're a vegetarian, especially that if you're basing all of your protein intake on plant-based foods, plant-based proteins are a little less efficient. And so the problem is that, because the high fiber content of plant-based diets, most people who are on plant-based diets, that proteins don't always get absorbed. So you're pooping a little bit extra out with the fiber. And therefore, if you think your protein needs might be 100 grams per day, if you're full vego, vegan type, you should probably go for 110, 120 just to be safe. Some benefits of consuming plant proteins is that they come with other things in them that we don't always find in animal products, right? So you get a more full complement of vitamins and minerals, especially from vegetables. Also, you get fiber. You don't find fiber in animal products, and both of those, all of those provide extra benefit nutritionally to consuming those plant-based protein foods. Soy is worth its own slide. Soy protein is out there and it's pretty common. Soy in general, I'm not a big fan of. When you read the dark side, Sean isn't a big fan either. Soy has been sort of abused, right? In its natural state, soy is great. It's a great bean. It's incredibly versatile. It's tasty. Some of you like to eat the edamame beans. Those are great. The organic little edamame pods that you get at Trader Joe's or wherever else, awesome. But when we start to process and manipulate soybeans, which they have been to the highest degree in our country and throughout the world, really, it can get a little dicey. So soy protein in general, it actually looks quite similar to animal protein. There's been a fair amount of research done on soy protein supplements, and they provide similar benefits as like a whey supplement, which is a milk-based protein. It's pretty much right up there in terms of the effects of consuming soy as a supplement. So again, getting back to my bigger concerns is, they just tend to be overproduced, genetically modified types of products. Soy is high in linoleic acid and some alpha-linoleic acid, which are the omega-3s. That has great anti-inflammatory effect, which we'll talk about in the fat discussion. Soy is high in calcium. It's high in something called an isoflavone, which is often referred to as a type of phytonutrient or micronutrient. It is the isoflavones will mimic the effect of estrogen, which is not good for everybody. There are individuals who are estrogen sensitive they should avoid the isoflavones, but it does prevent a nice protective mechanism of protective effect to the cardiovascular system for similar reasons that women experience improved or decreased risk of heart disease because of their natural circulating estrogen levels. So the isoflavones in soy could be a good thing. The issues come down to the genetically modified soy. In beans and nuts, and soy has this as well, there's a class of nutrients called anti-nutrients, which I guess technically doesn't make them nutrients. Anti-nutrients are a thing. Sean talks about them quite a bit in the dark side. I'll mention them here. I'll mention them a little bit more later on as well. Anti-nutrients are components in food that really aren't available for digestion and can actually prevent other nutrients in that food that are good for digestion and for our health to be digested and absorbed. So these anti-nutrients sometimes prevent the good in foods to get absorbed. And so beans definitely and nuts are high in these anti-nutrients. And so sometimes we need to treat them either through a cooking process or sometimes a soaking process or other ways to eliminate these anti-nutrients. Soaking beans in water does a really good job of getting rid of them. So for those of you that love to eat like whole black beans and you soak them, you get them in a can actually, pour the water out of the can, please, and rinse your beans because the anti-nutrients literally leach into the water of the canned beans. And if you're consuming that water from the beans, it's not good. So rinse them. There's issues with that. If you choose to eat soy products, fermented soy is much better than non-fermented soy. So things like tempeh and other fermented soy products are fantastic. Eat soy with caution. So high protein diets, are they harmful? They can be. High anything diet could be harmful, of course, right? So generally speaking, so one thing about protein, we didn't really talk much about strategies in terms of, we talked a little bit with carbohydrates going, you can eat no carbs and you can eat an 80% carb diet. With protein is pretty consistent. No matter what phase of training you're in, what part of your life you're in, protein intake shouldn't vary tons, right? I mean, if you're in the lower end of the spectrum, the zero point 0.8 grams per kg versus 2 grams per kg, sure, that's a difference of maybe 50 to 100 grams per day. But, we don't go full on like, hey, I'm on an 80% protein diet. It's really, really, really hard to do. And it's hard to sustain if you can even find a diet that could reach that level of protein intake. So there are individuals that do try and do high protein diets. And so what are the concerns of a high protein diet? So first, if you're consuming a high protein diet, and there are individuals that go on all meat diets, I've had some students try it. It's usually not a good outcome. They will be low in plant foods, right? And so if you're eating too much of one food, obviously something else is getting sacrificed. So the lack of plant foods, which is going to mean a lack of certain vitamins, certain minerals, certain phytochemicals, certain amount of fiber is going to be lost in that equation as well. So you're just missing out on other foods. You end up eliminating foods that you shouldn't be eliminating if you go high protein. These next 2 bullets, or 3 bullets actually, I put C's next to them because what a lot of research says is, intake of animal protein increases risk for heart disease, or excessive intake of red meat is linked with colon cancer and heart disease. The research isn't lying. These are associative types of research, like we talked about in our first discussion. This is epidemiological, large-scale type of stuff where, people who tend to eat more red meat or more animal protein are the people who tend to have greater rates of heart disease and certain types of cancers. The asterisks or the C's are there for these first 2 at least to say, you know what, these are legitimate studies. However, they're not looking at the type of meat or red meat consumed. And if we get into more the philosophy of this class, and really that philosophy of the dark side is like, you shouldn't be eating meat that is pumped full of hormones and antibiotics, and eating feed that isn't organic and all that stuff. So if we're eating really healthy animals, and I think this is a chapter 4 thing from the dark side, the wheel of life, or the wheel of health, we want to eat healthy animals. If we eat healthy animals, we're going to get health, and we're not going to get heart disease from eating, pasture-raised organic cows, right? And that are not eating, grains and pumped full of hormones and antibiotics and all the other chemicals. So that the caution there is, I'm not saying that you should go out and eat an all meat diet, but I'm also not saying that I don't think healthy. If you raise your own animals and ate them, they're not going to give you heart disease or cancer. I'm pretty confident of that. The burden on the kidneys, I search for I look for research in this world saying, okay, can a high protein diet be harmful to the kidneys? The potential is there, right? We talked about the excretion of nitrogen through ammonia or through urea, and that does put a burden on the kidneys. They need to work hard to get rid of that. I haven't found any convincing evidence that, if you go higher protein, that your kidneys are going to fail. And I think that's a very rare situation, if at all. So there are concerns with increased calcium loss with high protein diets. And some people argue if you're eating a high protein diet, a lot of protein foods are packaged with calcium to begin with. So increased calcium loss with high protein isn't a big deal, but that isn't always the case, right? Especially you start to do supplements of protein, and certain meats aren't always high in calcium. Actually, a lot of them aren't at all. And so one thing that happens to help us get rid of calcium, to deal with ammonia, is that the process is quite acidic in nature. And so when we are dealing with the acidity associated with the breakdown of proteins, ultimately to urea, that we need to neutralize that acid. And calcium is a buffer used to neutralize the acidity caused by protein breakdown. If you're eating large amounts of protein and having to deal with that acidity at a high rate, calcium losses can be significant. There is some evidence that in some individuals that calcium loss can lead to things like osteoporosis over time, brittle bones, that kind of stuff. So there is some evidence of this being an issue. Generally speaking, kind of like the previous 3 bullets there, not a huge deal, right? But it is something to be mindful of. Calcium intake is important. Take a supplement. What's considered high is maybe the best question to ask now. Like, well, what is high? Like, is 2.2 grams per kg high? It depends. Everything in this class depends, right? High protein diets, generally the research sort of puts this threshold at 350 grams a day. I have athletes that weigh 300 pounds. Them eating 350 grams a day of protein is not going to be dangerous to them. But an athlete who weighs 100 pounds going for 350 grams a day, that could be an issue. So it kind of depends on who you are and what you do. and how big you are and all that kind of stuff. But the 350 gram threshold, it's out there. The 350 gram threshold will put that burden on the kidneys. Again, there is some research out there that's tends to justify that. The increasing protein consumption at a very quick rate overwhelms our ability to break down some of these proteins, and so enzyme formation can actually get caught off guard, and so there's incomplete digestion that can cause some GI issues, some gastrointestinal issues. But we will adjust over time. But again, a slow ramp up is actually more important. There's something called rabbit starvation. And it's basically a situation, and I think there was some cases where this has actually happened with people eating rabbits, which are incredibly lean animals, that we end up getting protein poisoning. We need to eat protein with fats. And if we don't eat protein with fats, that's why I'm always a big advocate. You eat healthy animals. Don't take the skin off the chicken. Don't cut the fat off the beef that you're buying because it's good, organic, pasture-raised stuff, right? Keep it on there. But if there's too much protein being consumed, fats are necessary to achieve a balance. And so when we overdo the proteins, there can be issues with something called rabbit starvation. So moving on with proteins and protein consumption, individual amino acids are supplemented quite often, right? I've already mentioned glutamine. I've mentioned the branched chain amino acids. They can be pretty effective as sport supplements and even as health supplements in some contexts. Generally speaking, the body is designed to handle, digest, and absorb whole protein. So when you take an individual amino acid supplement, intentionally, it's intended to overwhelm the body with that amino acid. So one problem sometimes if you're taking these too often is it can cause imbalances. If you're taking too much of one amino acid, other amino acids may not get absorbed, right? We have specific transport mechanisms that where, facilitated diffusion, it can get overwhelmed, and maybe a certain type of amino acid is not making it in that needs to make it in there. So we can be at risk for that, but that really takes an overzealous type of individual to consume a whole bunch of an individual amino acid, but it's possible. Some good supplements that have been proven in the research world to be effective. The branched chain amino acids are fantastic. Glutamine is great for certain things. All amino acids have an individual function, meaning if you consume just that one amino acid left alone and not needed to form other proteins, that individual amino acid will stimulate or lead to certain functions in the body. And so therefore, when we overconsume them, take a supplement of them, some of them will go to the free amino acid pool into forming enzymes and hormones, but then because there's so much of it available, the excess of that amino acid will go out to serve out some of its other functions. And so on this screen, this is a graphic, not from your text, of a group of amino acids that are commonly used as supplements. Their claims, not all of these are totally legit, but I would say, arginine does what it says to do on here. Aspartate, there is some research evidence on aspartate improving in metabolism. Glutamine, like I've already said, I'm a big fan. Ornithine, I never see ornithine out there in terms of a sporting type of supplement. It may be out there for diabetics potentially. Branched chain amino acids are superstars right now. They definitely help with exercise performance and adaptation. And the rest on the bottom of that graphic, there's some, but not great evidence to support their use, generally speaking. But that's a list of some of the individual amino acids. We'll talk more about them in the ergogenic aid talk in this class. So, but those are there. Have a look. If you're about to buy a protein supplement, so not an individual amino acid supplement, but a whole protein supplement, they can be useful. I'm not a big fan of having my athletes and clients use them on a regular basis, and I use them more as an emergency product. Hey, if you get to the end of the day and you're 30, 40, 50 grams short of what your protein goals were, supplement could be useful, right? But don't plan on it on a regular basis. Like, for breakfast, I have a protein supplement every day. It's like, no, do real food. Real food is always better, right? So that's my philosophy. That's my mindset with protein supplements. That being said, right, they can be useful, and there are some good ones out there, and there's some not so good ones out there. So some good questions to ask about protein supplements that you might consider consuming. First, look at the protein quantity in the product. Look at the label. How many grams of protein are you getting per serving? And additionally, look at what other stuff you're getting, right? Because if you get a protein, supplement, it should have in the neighborhood of 20 to 50 grams per serving. Over 50, you're going to pee a bunch of it out. It's too much. Less than 20, it's not enough. So you're going to have to do 2 servings. So, my goal, I like to see 30 to 40 grams. That's like my sweet spot. Yeah, 30 to 40 grams of protein per serving. But what else is in it? Is it 30 to 40 grams of protein and then 100 grams of carbs? That's more like a meal. I just want the protein. I don't want extra stuff. So I'm a very big advocate of let it just be protein. If I want to add carbohydrates, I'll do it with a different source, right? I'll mix it with a milk or I'll throw something else in there. So how much is in there? Does it meet your needs? Is it a good quality one? And there's better and better quality protein supplements coming out in the market nowadays. I see them coming from organically raised animals, and I see it coming from only grass-fed cows if it's a whey protein, right? So we're seeing a lot cleaner protein products. I mean, these are frankenfoods, right? I mean, protein supplements, you got this powder, and this was once what? This was once milk? How did you get it to this point? So you have to try and at least minimize some of the negative potential of this lab-produced product by at least making sure the source is of good quality. So looking at the source is a first step. Second step is look at the additives, like how many other things are added to the product. Look on the ingredients list that you don't like. Why is this in here? This sounds like some crazy chemical. Google it, right? The beauty of the world right now is you can be in a supplement store. If you have access to a smartphone, type in that ingredient and it'll tell you immediately if it's legit or not. So examine.com, EXAMINE, examine.com should be all of your go-to source for supplement information. Examine.com is the best. I don't have to tell you why, because you go visit it and you'll go, oh yeah, this is definitely the best. Other important question to ask, is a supplement necessary? Do you actually need it, right? I have a lot of athletes who come to me saying, oh yeah, I take this 50 grams of protein every day. I'm like, well, what are you eating? And I look and I'm like, you're already eating too much protein. That supplement's just adding to your protein load. You don't need it. Can you afford it? Will it help with performance? Will it help with your health? That's again, do you kind of need it? And does it have any harmful effects? And that's a harder one to suss out until you actually take it, but do your research. So when it comes to protein consumption around exercise, as we get up to an exercise event, whether it's training or competition, the closer to the event we get, the greater focus should be on carbohydrates. But we can still consume some protein, right? Quick protein is usually the key. The term quick is in reference to proteins that are liquid. That means they get out of the stomach quickly and have the greatest chance of getting absorbed and delivered to where they're needed the quickest, right? Eating a piece of steak, that could stay in your stomach for hours and hours and hours. And if you're looking within a couple hours or less of an exercise session, a piece of steak's not going to do you any good. So during exercise and competition, protein initially for maybe a decade ago was like, oh yeah, it's all about carbs. You don't need protein. Proteins aren't doing you any good. And that mindset's changed a little bit. There's been some good research done out there on protein consumption during exercise, and it has mostly focused on the branched chain amino acids. And so there is some good evidence that adding a little bit of amino acids to your regimen during training can delay fatigue, and it does it in 2 different ways. First, depending on the type of training, the duration especially, it can provide those substrates for the Krebs cycle to help with oxidative metabolism, right? So it helps that the breakdown of fats and carbohydrates and aerobically. Those especially are the branched chain amino acids. They will help the Krebs cycle spin. So that's one way that amino acids during exercise or protein during exercise can help. The other is through a process called the tryptophan flux. Another potential cool band name, right? So the tryptophan flux is pretty interesting. So as we exercise and our body's using those branched chain amino acids for the Krebs cycle, as you'd imagine, right, blood concentrations of those branched chain amino acids starts to decrease. So the longer you're going, the less branched chain amino acids are in your blood. When the branched chain amino acids drop below a certain threshold, it allows tryptophan to enter the brain at a greater rate than normal, and that's called the tryptophan flux. When tryptophan enters the brain, it gets converted to something called serotonin, or it increases the creation of a hormone called serotonin. Some of you are familiar with serotonin, right? It's our happy hormone. It makes us feel good. It also makes us feel really tired. And so when the tryptophan flux happens, it literally tells our brain that we want to stop exercising, and our brain tells our muscles to slow down. And so the tryptophan flux leads to fatigue. And so this is called central fatigue because the brain is in control of this fatigue. It's not happening in the muscles, it's being regulated by the brain. It's a real thing. And so the evidence now to take branched chain amino acids to keep those concentrations high to prevent the tryptophan flux can be important. Obviously, it depends on the type of athlete you are. If you do short duration stuff, if you're doing, I do an hour in the gym, you don't need it. But if you're that endurance athlete or you're doing 2 or 3 sessions in a day, some of you, during certain times of the season, you're doing 2-a-days, 3-a-days, the branched chain amino acids, just for that reason, can play an important role. They play other roles as well. But this is just the branched chains during exercise, or at least to make sure that they're present in high enough concentrations during exercise. So post-exercise or post-competitions is when protein is most important, I think, or most effective, right? We've already talked about recovery protein, how much. This says 6 to 20 grams. That's a typo. So right, we're after that neighborhood. Let's go for that 20 to 40 grams of quality protein as soon as possible after training, right? There's different types of proteins. The casein, which I mentioned earlier, it's considered a slower protein, even though if you're drinking it, it's faster than consuming a food-based protein. But whey protein is also a milk-based protein like casein. It's a lot quicker. So there is, again, if you're splitting hairs, which some people like to do, whey protein will help that recovery process happen the quickest. Soy and vegetable proteins vary in terms of their speed, but whey protein is going to be one of your faster ones. To me, if it's coming in liquid form, the speed at which its recovery happens from that protein recovery drink, the differences are minimal, but there are some slight differences. Look them up. Essential amino acids are key. We talked about this. The presence of leucine, also key. The sooner the better, right? To maximize recovery, carbohydrates need to be included in the recovery drink. There's some research out there that says, if you exclude the carbohydrates, you're still going to gain some strength and muscle mass. Okay, those things will still happen, but we're talking about recovery from exercise that probably depleted carbohydrates firstly. So we're going to be replacing those carbohydrates, so we're getting our glycogen back and all that. And secondly, the presence of carbohydrates will help with that insulin release from that recovery food or drink. And the presence of insulin will help protein get into the cells a little bit more quickly. So including some carbohydrates in that post-exercise recovery drink is important. I push chocolate milk on a lot of my athletes over at St. Mary's and some of my clients, depending. Chocolate milk has a pretty good ratio of carbohydrates to protein. It's easily accessible. It tastes good. It's kind of a more real food than some of these crazy protein shakes. So I'm a fan of the chocolate milk. Finally, ideal protein sources. You should be getting this information from the dark side, but I keep this in here just to remind myself, to remind you to look at the dark side, chapter 5 in the dark side, which should be in that zone right about now. It tells you this is where you get everything. But, animal-based proteins, you need to find healthy animals. It is that decision. It's like, do I want to eat an animal that was incredibly sick because it had to be pumped, or it was pumped full of hormones, antibiotics, it was eating feed that was obviously, laced with pesticides and all that kind of stuff? Is it worth it? I would argue no. Is it way more expensive to eat healthy animals? I would confirm yes. Is it worth eating 1 steak a week instead of 3 because the price difference is that much, but that 1 steak is a healthy animal? I would argue yes. So try and do your best. And I know it's not realistic, and sometimes you just got to do what you can do. But if you have the means, I think quite often the decision to go healthy, just a less amount of that healthy, is better than not going healthy at all. So animal-based proteins, go for the good ones. Plant-based, again, try and keep it as clean as possible. Non-GMO organic products are ideal, and again, it's always, you got to deal with whatever means you have. So, all right, enjoy the sunset. That's it for protein. I will see you next time.